while back. Usually I'm cold. So I'm hot, and so I want it cold. The guy who was speaking and teaching us must live in a freezer because it was unbelievably cold. I mean, there wasn't a person in the room that wasn't shivering through the entire thing. Usually there's kind of a balance. So there's some people here who are cold and some people who are warm. But in that particular room, he literally had all of us freezing to death. And it's one of those things, I guess, he was sweating. That was the other thing that was really wild to me. Probably some health condition that was undiagnosed at this point is what I kind of thought. But anyway, let me get started. For those of you who don't already know me, I'm Leigh Hilton. Our firm has helped over 6,000 families protect the assets that they leave to their loved ones from divorce, creditors, and lawsuits. And that's usually what resonates most with my clients, is making sure that what you leave behind is protected. I've also helped over 300 families implement the plans that we've designed after the loved one has passed away. And the reason why that's significant to you is most people, when they do a will or a trust, it's kind of a depressing thing to talk about. So we're talking about if you die, who gets your stuff, which is what the speech is about today. But I'm also talking to you about if you become disabled, who's going to handle your finances for you? How are things going to be done? So most likely, most of my clients, and most of other attorneys' clients, when you get done having that depressing conversation and you actually get the documents home, you're going to put them on a shelf, or you're going to put them in your safe deposit box, and you're going to totally forget about them. But what you really want is for them to work when they're needed, and not have your family discover that when they're actually trying to use them, that there's something missing in those documents. So why it's significant that we've actually helped the families after somebody's passed away is we know for sure they work on the back end. Now on the bottom of this, I let you know that we're a member of Wealth Counsel. Wealth Counsel is a group of about 3,000 attorneys nationwide, and we also collaborate on making sure that whatever we design for you works on the back end. And if another attorney's had something go wrong on a set of documents, or a situation come up that somebody hasn't thought of before, we're able to make sure that our documents don't have that problem in the future. One of the things that I have in my trusts and in my wills is a standby special needs trust, and I'll mention that to you again later in the speech. But it's there for the just in case. So if somebody who inherits from you is disabled at the time they inherit, it's protective language. And the reason why I have it in there is another member of Wealth Counsel had a situation where it was needed and it wasn't there. So I learned from that other attorney having that experience what we need to add to our documents. So it's good to have somebody who actually collaborates with other attorneys. I'm a member of NALA, which is the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys, and we collaborate both on the Medicaid and the Veterans Benefits. I have one other attorney that works for me at this time. Her name is Gretchen Benoken. She's actually was personally chosen by me and trained by me, and if you meet with her, it's the same as meeting with me. She's actually got more experience than I do. I think she's been practicing 30 years, something like that. But occasionally I have people call, they've seen a speech and they want to meet with me, and it's hard to get in on my calendar. Gretchen can also meet with you and take care of things. Just recently, about 6 months ago, published my book, Who Gets Your Stuff When You Die, which is this speech is based on. When I first started talking to my publisher, he said, just record your speech, transcribe it. We can make a book out of that. So I recorded my speech, I transcribed it, I sent it to him, and he said, you got about 1/8 of a book. So I spent the next 2 years trying to come up with other stories that you guys would like to know, and came up with this book. I'm actually already in my mind starting to work on the second edition based on questions people ask at seminars like this. Your folders on the left-hand side, most of you have started already filling it out, but the sheet on the left, if you fill it out, what I do with that is I add you to my newsletter. So what you'll get is invitations to similar breakfasts like this. You'll also get, I usually do one legal article a month. So you'll get a legal article that kind of updates you on something that's going on law-wise. And then frequently I try to tell you one personal related story. It's becoming harder. My boys are now 16 and 18, and they have editorial rights. Because I used to be able to come up with something funny they'd done and tell you guys that story. But I embarrassed one of the stories I told, and so now I have to run it by them, is it okay to tell the story of what happened? So, in fact, I need to ask my oldest, I have a college related to him, but I need to check with him and make sure it's okay to tell it before I tell you guys. So maybe that'll be coming up in an upcoming issue. But I don't try to any emails. Absolutely, most you would get 3 emails from me. Somebody earlier asked, is it okay to come to more than one of these? I'm fine with that. And in fact, it sometimes takes people 3 or 4 times to get to the point where they really they're able to decide what they want to do as far as how they want things to go to their family. So it may be things I bring up, things you're thinking of. It may take you a while to get comfortable with what you're thinking of doing with your family or doing for your family through your plan, and I don't mind you coming over and over. All right, ground rules. 2 things. If you can hold questions to the end, that would be good, because a lot of times when somebody asks a question, it really literally is going to be 2 slides from now, 3 slides from now. I've also been at events where somebody just liked to talk, and so they would ask questions over and over through the whole speech, and it got distracting. So I like to hold questions till the end. If anybody needs a pen, I've got some. If you'll just write down what your question is so you don't forget, then we can ask that at the end. And then every event you're at tells you to turn off your cell phones, so if you guys will turn off your cell phones, or at least make them where they don't make noise, that'd be great. All right, who gets your stuff when you die? 14 secrets to protecting the 2 most important things in your life: everyone you love and everything you own. And the way I came up with this tagline is I was working with a business coach, and I talked to him about it. He said, I want you to figure out who your favorite client is. So if somebody asks you, who do you want to work with, you're able to communicate to them who the type of person you want to work with. And so I picked my top 5 people at that period of time that I really liked. When they came in the office, I was excited to see them. I enjoyed working with them. That's who I wanted to work with. And it took a while to figure out what they had in common, because 2 of the people were grandparents, and they had a large family, and they were wanting to make sure that what they left to their kids made it down to the grandkids. And 2 of the people were women who had never married and had no children. But they were very involved, and in fact, if I gave you their names, you'd know who they were, because they're very involved in the Denton community. And they've had buildings or schools named after them, but they love people, and people love being around them. And I know I told you 5, I don't remember what the 5th one was, but but what I thought about is what those people have in common is they love people. They want to do things for other people. They care about their family, or they care about other people around them. So I like working with people that love people. All right, let me go through. Distributing your stuff. Choosing who's going to get your stuff and helping them keep it. So when you meet with me, I'm going to ask you some nosy questions about the people you're leaving money to. I'm going to want to know where they work, if they're responsible with money, if their spouses are responsible with money, and if their kids are responsible with money. And when I'm asking you these questions, I'm looking for a lot of things. I'm looking for, do you like your daughter or son-in-law? Do you think your daughter and son-in-law would influence your child to spend the money in a way that you wouldn't approve of? Is anybody disabled, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit. But one of the reasons why we need to get to know your family in order to design a plan is to make sure that what we put together will actually work with your family dynamics. I actually had a lady many years ago that came in, and she told me about her fairy tale son and the wonderful relationship that they had, and how they saw each other all the time, they got along great, everything was beautiful. And then she got dementia, and when she got dementia, I met her real son. And her real son, she hadn't seen in 15 years. They hadn't spoken. He was mad at her. Her and her husband, which was his father, had gotten divorced, and he was mad at her over the divorce. So he hadn't spoken to her literally in 15 years. So this woman has dementia, she's paranoid, and the person that comes into town and starts making decisions on her behalf is someone she hasn't spoken to in 15 years. Now, this lady is also a prominent woman in Denton, knows a lot of people, and she was embarrassed and worried that if she told me the truth about her son, I might tell other people. So instead of telling me that and actually appointing one of her best friends, and she had many really good friends who would have taken care of her, we instead drew up all her documents to have this son she didn't trust. They're still in litigation. It's been going on about 3 years now. So it's much, much better to trust the attorney you're working with enough to tell them about the real family. Now, I can honestly tell you that my fairy tale families where everything is beautiful and everybody gets along, I have 5 of them. I've been doing this for 20-something years. There's 5 of them, and I'm actually a little cynical because they haven't died yet. So the that lady probably would have counted as one of my 5. But very rarely when I actually start digging and we start talking through what's going on with your family, am I going to find a situation where everybody gets along beautifully, everything is fine. So don't be embarrassed if that's your story. Now, if you have one of my 5 fairy tales, I would love to add extra. So I'm fine if you have a good family, everything's good, everybody gets along. But the other thing to think of is death brings stress on the family, and I will have people in their 50s tell me the reason why they're mad at their sister is because their mom bought the sister a bike and not them, or bought their sister a nicer car than they bought them. So people will go back and resent things that happened a long time ago when something happens to their parents. So we got to somewhat think through that. The other thing is I've had 2 situations where somebody insisted upon putting 2 people that didn't like each other as co-trustees, and I was unable to talk them out of it. One of them was a man who worked all his life and he had accumulated a pretty good sum of money, but he wanted to make sure that his daughter didn't blow it in a short period of time. And he didn't want his son to either, his daughter was more likely to spend the money. And so he left $40,000. But he put them as co-trustees, so $40,000 per year. So $40,000 per year is what he wanted them to have for the rest of their lives. But he put them as co-trustees. And as soon as he passed away, they started fighting. And what he told me whenever we were setting up the plan, they fought their whole life. They've never been able to stand each other. But I'm going to put them both in charge because I want to teach them to get along. And they both are money driven. So if they figure out that it's going to cost them a whole bunch of money to fight, there's no way they're going to fight when I'm gone. Well, he was wrong. They immediately started fighting as soon as he was gone. And the one thing that was important to him, that the money last, that the money be given out over time, actually ended up not happening. Because when they had to settle in court, they actually settled to she was in charge of her money, he was in charge of his money, and she could take it out however she wanted. So if things are important to you, we need to think through, talk through what you want to put together. But the attorney really is going to draw up whatever you ask them to draw up. So if you're absolutely insistent they need to be together, the attorney will draw them up together, but warn you that maybe it's not a good idea long term. Handle with stuff. What to do if a beneficiary is disabled. So if you're leaving money to anybody who's disabled, we need to talk about government benefits. And what we usually do is we create something called a special needs trust, or a supplemental needs trust, and they're actually the same thing, they just have 2 different names. That type of trust so that the money that you leave to that beneficiary is protected. It makes it where they can still qualify for whatever government benefits they qualify for, but the money's protected. But one of the things to think about when drawing up a trust like this is a lot of attorneys that don't know a lot about this area will draw it up so that the person that's disabled cannot get money that would disqualify them for government benefits. But sometimes that's the better thing to do, to let them have that money. Maybe the government benefit isn't going to take care of everything they need. So you could actually be unintentionally making this person live in poverty when they don't have to. So for example, for SSI, which is one of the disability-related programs, they're allowed to have about $735 a month. If you pay for housing or food, because that $735 is supposed to cover housing and food for this person. I know it's crazy. The number's too low, I know. What ends up happening if you start paying for that, it starts reducing the amount of their benefit. But the maximum it can reduce is 1/3. So they can lose about 1/3 of $735 if you pay for their housing and food. So in a lot of situations, it's kind of a why not? I mean, why not pay for their housing and food, give them a decent place to live, if you have a trust that you've got money that you have control of, and yes, it reduces the benefit. But we've got to watch, because if you reduce the benefit too far through that and other things, because it also gets reduced if they work, you could make them lose Medicaid, and Medicaid may be the only type of health insurance they're able to get. because a good portion of the people on SSI are actually disabled from birth, and so they're not going to be able to get on a government, or even under the Affordable Care Act, they're not going to be able to get health insurance. So it's something to look at. Just came back from a conference where we spent the entire week learning about how to make sure that we do these things properly. Mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm going to mention it one more time. We also do standby supplemental needs trust for just in case somebody becomes disabled, because we can't predict the future. And I'm fully aware, I like to meet with you, and I'll talk to you about that later, but I like to meet with you every 3 years and just see what's going on with your family and make sure that what we put together still works. But I'm fully aware that it's a depressing topic, and occasionally people see me, they create a plan, and they put it on the shelf, and they don't die till 30 years later. We've got to make sure it still works. So that's part of why it's in there. And then also, you just don't know what will happen in life. Stuff happens. Smart moves if you or your spouse are diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia or anything where everybody but you is going to become disabled. And I know that's a weird way to phrase it, but a lot of people that have a diagnosis like this, especially in the beginning, are in denial that it's actually going to affect them. So in the early stages, when you first get a diagnosis like this, we can do a lot of things to update your plan to make sure it works the way you want it to. So for instance, the way I have my plan set up, my husband and I are both in charge of our trust. In the event one of us becomes incompetent, then whoever's still competent is in charge. And then we've named somebody to be in charge if we're both unable to be in charge. So if somebody has a diagnosis like this, when they first come in, they can think through and pick who they want to have be in charge of their money. And like I said, probably all of you have the fairy tale families. But if you have any bad people in your life, that's who comes out of the woodwork when somebody needs to be in charge of your money. And there are people that will actually try to become in charge of your money that don't have your best interest at heart because they want access to the money. There are also people out of guilt who you don't necessarily have that good of a relationship with. For some reason, they'll feel like they're supposed to take care of you during that period of time. And you're probably not going to want those people to be the ones in charge. So if we plan ahead, we can actually name who's in charge. We can also name who's not in charge. But the other really important thing to do with somebody who has a diagnosis like this is most estate plans are what we call I love you wills. Husband leaves everything to wife, and wife leaves everything to husband. So whoever's left standing is in charge. And sometimes people die out of order. So sometimes the healthy spouse, the one that hasn't been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia, dies first. So that leaves the person with Alzheimer's or dementia in charge of the money. It also leaves that money vulnerable to Medicaid. So if they need to go in a nursing home, that money is vulnerable to Medicaid taking it. So it's worth adjusting and looking at the plan. Incapacity stuff. What if you're out of it? So what if you're unable to make your own decisions? Like I said, with a trust, we can name who's in charge of the money next. Without a trust, what happens is people go to court and they fight over who gets to be in charge of your money. And like I said, sometimes that goes badly. If there are people in your life that wouldn't do the right thing, those are the people that step in. It's also an extremely expensive and public process. So like the lady who I told you didn't want anybody to know that her and her son had a bad relationship, well, that's all public now because they're in a court battle, and if anybody's nosy, they can go down to the courthouse and get all that information. So if you don't have something in writing, you could have that happen. And then I have people tell me all the time, well, I haven't seen this person in 15 years, this son or daughter. That still is the person that sometimes will try to step up and come in. The court will also appoint an attorney to defend you if they're trying to get guardianship over you. And that attorney has a duty to diligently defend you even if they don't believe that the guardianship, that you are able to make decisions on your own. So it can become extremely expensive. I had a man that I actually represented, or I was the person appointed to represent him in a guardianship, and he actually believed that he had won the Jamaican lottery. And he was sending $200 to Jamaica, which wouldn't be all that bad except for the fact that he had short-term memory loss. He actually sent $200 to Jamaica 1,000 times. So he had lost $200,000. Now, when I tell you that, a lot of people think, well, he must have been somebody who wasn't all that smart prior to becoming incompetent. He was actually literally someone who had worked for a very large company negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts. And in his diminished mental capacity, He had decided that this thing with Jamaica was a multi-million-dollar contract that he was negotiating. And so when his family finally got him convinced that he had sent $200,000, he said, well, if I don't send them the next $500 that they've asked for, I'm going to lose the full $200,000, and I'm on the edge of negotiating this deal. Why would you not let me send the $500? Now, he had a power of attorney, so he'd named his son as power of attorney, which means his son would be able to handle his finances for him. When his son tried to take over the finances, he revoked the power of attorney. So occasionally people will say, oh, I don't need a trust, I can just use a power of attorney. But when you actually need to use the power of attorney, sometimes it gets revoked. And because a court hadn't declared him incompetent yet, he had the authority to revoke that. So if we have a trust instead with medical doctor letters, the son would have been able to come in and take care of the finances. Healthcare stuff. Who makes healthcare decisions for you if you can't? I had a lady many years ago came into my office. She said, my best friend is in the hospital unconscious. Her son, who she hasn't seen in forever, and all my stories have no good sons, but there are no good daughters out there too. These happen to be no good son stories. So the no good son is in town. He's trying to make medical decisions for her. I know she'd want me to make those decisions. Can we go to court and get me authority to make decisions for her? And the answer to that was no. At that stage, the neighbor was unconscious in the hospital. If she had beforehand come in and drawn up a healthcare power of attorney, she could have said, I want my neighbor to make those decisions. You can actually also draw up, in no event does my son get to make those decisions. So the neighbor could have come in and had the documents exactly how she wanted them, if that's how she wanted them. But if you don't do it ahead of time, there's not a way to do anything different. So it's actually, in some ways, more important than a lot of the other things I draw up, because you're still alive, you're in the hospital bed, who do you trust to make those decisions for you? The other thing that I talk through with people is, do you want to be kept alive on machines if doctors say that there's no hope? And about 90% of my clients will tell me, no, I do not want to be kept alive on machines. But what you mean by that and what I mean by that may be totally different. I have a lot of clients, as long as they can still communicate, as long as they can interact, or there's some chance of them recovering, they want to be kept alive on machines. I have several clients who are ICU nurses that tell me that they never want a feeding tube under any circumstance. But I have a client right now that's walking around with a feeding tube, and he's actually able to go to family events. I think I might be okay with a feeding tube then. Feeding tube in the bed, probably not. But I don't know until you get in the situation. So what I encourage my clients to do is actually have that depressing conversation with your family. What do you want? How do you want your family to make that decision? And that gives them peace of mind. You said you didn't want to be kept alive in this situation, or you said you did. Where's your line? What's the information? Now, in California, they actually have you, when you fill this out, you actually say yes or no to feeding tubes, yes or no to the antibiotics. You actually have a list of 20 things. But in the abstract, how do we know? Because I think I would have marked no to feeding tubes based on what I've been told, but this one person seemed to me like he was having decent quality of life, at least in that moment. So maybe it's okay. So have the conversation with your family so they know what you want. One other thing, difference between DNR and directive. DNR is what most people have at the point where you're in the hospital, usually you're terminal. Do not resuscitate means don't do any sort of extraordinary measures. What I have and what I do for my clients is called a directive to physicians. It says no life support after you've tried, after you've seen whether there's any hope or any ability to recover. So if I had a DNR, which I don't, if I had a DNR and I had a heart attack in the middle of this speech, and I had a bracelet or something that let the EMT know that I had a DNR, and you call 911, they're not supposed to do CPR on me. And so most of my clients, and I'll have really healthy people come in and tell me they want a DNR. Probably you don't. What you probably want is a directive saying after they've done the CPR, they've rushed me off to the hospital, they've put me on a ventilator, they've evaluated things, and they've said, listen, she's got brain damage, probably will never recover. Then you want life support removed. HIPAA stuff, privacy laws. Privacy laws, when you go to the doctor or hospital, you sign that you've read their privacy policy. Most of us don't read it, but they are all different. And the doctors really can say, the reason why the law came into effect is there were doctors selling your medical information. So they were selling the information that you had diabetes, and that's why you suddenly got all this diabetic drug information and all the different things in the mail. So you got put on a mailing list. Well, they were getting paid to do that. And so the reason why the law came into effect is they said, wait a minute, you shouldn't be selling people's medical information. But the doctor that you go to really could put on the form, I'm going to tell the drug manufacturers that you have this illness and I'm going to get paid to do it. It could be in the fine print of what you're signing. So you might want to look through it, just make sure that kind of thing isn't there when you read it. But the other thing that's bad about the law is there's not a set form. So every doctor, every hospital, because the penalties for breaking it is they could go to jail or pay huge fines, have actually hired somebody to design a form for them. And so they want to make sure it's signed. So I add language to the financial power of attorney and the medical power of attorney. Joaquin, it's a little bit cold. Can we warm it up just slightly? I told you guys the freezer story and then I started to freeze you. I'm sorry. All right. So privacy law. So what I add to my financial power of attorney and my medical power of attorney is language that says that whatever the doctor or hospital wants signed, your people that you want to have the information can sign it. So that way they have access to the medical information if they need to have that. The other thing that I do is when I have somebody in my trust named as co-trustees, or anybody steps in other than you as trustee, they need to sign a privacy authorization. And the reason why they do, I've actually got a situation like this right now. I've got a brother and sister who are co-trustees. The daughter believes the brother is starting to be incompetent, but the doctors will not talk to her about what's going on with him. And so if we have the privacy authorization, then she could actually look at the medical records and find out what's going on. And it would be the same way if son was appointed first and she was appointed second. She would need access to that information to decide whether she needs to step in. Because I don't know if you guys have been around people that have become incompetent, but it's not a bright line thing. So it's not one day you're perfectly competent, everything's good, and the next day you're drooling and you have to go somewhere, like to a mental institution. It's really a spectrum. And so based on that spectrum, you start making kind of bad decisions and people start worrying about you. And then eventually you get to the point where you're truly not able to make decisions. But a lot of times during that period of time from when we're perfectly competent to when we start making a few stupid decisions, people end up losing a whole lot of money. One of my clients recently, her dad was all proud. He had sold, they had 1,000 acres, and he sold the 1,000 acres for $400 an acre. And I pretty much don't even have to tell you where it is. $400 an acre is not enough money for the 1,000 acres. He thought it was in the 40s. And so, the 1940s. And so back in the 1940s, if you sold land for $400 an acre, he had made a deal. And he was really, really proud of it. But prior to that, they did not realize that Dad was making bad decisions. And there's no way to undo it because the person that bought it from him had no reason to know, other than he sold it crazy cheap, that he was not competent. And the person that bought it from him was a neighbor, and he really thought he sold it to him cheap because he wanted the neighbor to have it, so to preserve it as open land. So there was no way to undo it. So a lot of times it's hard to know. So if you could check on somebody or get the information, you're going to have a smoother transition. Who needs benefits? This is on Medicaid and veterans benefits. I actually give an hour speech on this. Usually we do it at least once a month. And the main thing I want to do with veterans and Medicaid, I'm going to give you guys kind of a high-level view so you know whether it's something you need to talk about or think about. Veterans benefits in particular, the type that we do is an improved pension. It's called aid and attendance. There's also one called housebound that we help with. It's really for the point where your medical expenses start exceeding your income, or when the net number from those two things is $2,000 or less is when it comes into play. So for most veterans, the time that we would start talking about this is if you need to move into memory care or assisted living, or you've started having to have somebody come to the house and take care of you. That's when it comes up. And a lot of times with this, we actually help improve the life and the life expectancy of the spouse at home that's taking care of the veteran who's ill. Because if we can get them an extra couple $1,000s a month, it makes a huge difference in the quality of life for that spouse. And I've actually had two women, and I'm sure there's a whole lot more out there, but I've had two women who were taking care of their husbands 24 hours a day with Alzheimer's that died first. And they were the healthier spouses. But if you have to take care of somebody 24 hours a day, and in some ways it's similar to when we had babies. When you have babies, you have to listen for them through the whole night to make sure they're not getting up. The same thing if you're taking care of a spouse in a situation like that. So both of these women were not getting enough sleep. So they were having to listen at night to make, because if their husbands got up, they would fall or hurt themselves, so they had to wake up at a moment's notice anytime the husband got up. And so they were so exhausted that both of them died from pneumonia. And so my point is, if we could get them an extra $2,000 a month and have some care help, we could make a huge difference in the quality of life. This veterans benefit also helps widows of spouses. Widows of veterans, and it also helps spouses of veterans. There's a portion of the benefit. And a lot of times people don't even know it's out there. The veteran has to have served 90 days in the military.